The calendar has turned and it's now November, which means it's time for Spring Framework 7 and Spring Boot 4. That's right. Later this month, those two will be released with a whole new set of features. And on this channel, I'm taking a look at a lot of those features. You'll find a playlist either somewhere up here or in the description below. But today I want to take a look at some testing improvements in Spring Framework 7. And this is specifically around something called the RestTestClient. Now, if you made some REST APIs in the past and you wanted to test them out, maybe you were using the new REST client that came in Spring Boot 3.2 as an alternative to the REST template. But how do you test those things? Because there wasn't a way to do that. You could use the test REST template that was available, but hey, I'm not really using the REST template. I'm using the REST client. I want to be able to test using that. So then the question becomes, well, why don't I just create an instance of the REST client in my tests? And that's not what that's used for. You want testing infrastructure to make that easy. You want to be able to make calls using the REST client, but you also want a nice Fluent API to be able to test, validate the responses, assert some things against those, and so forth. So you were able to use the test REST template before, but now the RestTestClient is there, and it's going to make our life a little bit easier. So I'm going to switch over to my screen. Again, if you have written tests in the past using the test REST template, those are still available. Now, I've made it a point in past videos to say that the REST template was not going anywhere because it was just marked as like feature complete in the API docs. That is now no longer the case. The REST template is going to be deprecated at some point. So we need to start moving to the REST client. And now that we have this testing infrastructure, we can use something called the RestTestClient. So I'll leave you with the API docs. Again, nice fluid API. You see not a ton of methods in here. Makes it very easy to understand for me as far as like what it's able to do. There's also some great documentation in the Spring Framework docs. If you are taking a look at this and we're not on 7.0 yet, you can always come in here and choose the preview and then go ahead and check out the RestTestClient. I've also got a guide over on my website, so you can check that out. That'll be in the link in the description below as well. And finally, part of that blog post will kind of send you off to the GitHub repo for the code that we're going to write today. And I think it's best way to understand this is really dive in and just provide a couple of different scenarios and how to use the RestTestClient and when to use like which scenario. So we will do that. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to go over to start.spring.io. I'm going to say dev.danvega. We will call this the RestTestClient. I'm just going to put this in the root package. Let's just call this RestTestClient. Sure. Here is a new feature. If you haven't seen, I kind of tweeted this out or sent this out on socials the other day. Now you can change your configuration properties from properties to YAML if you wanted to here. So now when I create the project, I will use application.yaml instead of properties. For those of you who really enjoyed YAML, probably the first thing you did was go into a new project and rename properties to YAML and then fix like the one line that was in there, right? So no longer do you have to do that. I'm going to use JDK 25, and the only thing we're going to need for this is web. We're just going to test some web things out, so that will be sufficient. So with that, I will click generate. It will download a new zip. I'll open it up in my favorite IDE, which is IntelliJ. You can open it up in whatever text editor or IDE you're most sufficient in. With that, we have what we need. Let's write some code. All right, so here we are in my application. I'm going to paste in the README from the final GitHub repo they're going to go through because there's a couple things I want to talk about. First, what is the RestTestClient? It's a new unified testing tool in Spring Framework 7 that makes it easy to test REST APIs. Think of it as combining the best features of MockMVC and WebTestClient into a single API. And I can't agree more. It feels like that when you start using it. So we have this RestTestClient, one consistent API for all types of tests, fluent, readable syntax, works for unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end tests, easy to learn and use. I love that. I love everything about that. And that's completely how I feel when I started using this. So we'll get into these things here, but I wanted to put this in here so that we can look at some of those. So the way that I'm going to test this, I'm going to first create just a to-do class. So a to-do record. I should have made that a record, huh, Dan? So it's a record. And this record is going to have a few things. It's going to have a long ID, a long user ID, a string title, and then a Boolean completed. So we are just working with this idea of to-dos because eventually I'll reach out to a fake API, the JSON placeholder service, to get a bunch of to-dos. So I have this to-do, but I'm going to create a simple to-do controller that's not going to use a REST client yet. So I'm going to say simple to-do controller. And in this simple to-do controller, we are just going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to make this a REST controller. We'll say this is the request mapping. This is going to be /API/todos/simple, just so we can kind of separate those out. And then I'm going to create a get mapping. This is for /, and this is going to return a list of to-dos. So we'll say find all. And all this is going to do is return list.of, and we'll say new to do. So first to do, and it is completed. All right. So we have a list of to-dos, and then really I'm just going to return one of them, which in this case we only have one. So maybe we'll find it by its ID. Again, I only have one ID, but you get the idea. So long ID, and then we'll go ahead and just return the new to-do. We don't need an actual list here. So let's get rid of that and that, right? Okay, so now I have this simple kind of controller. And in this case, I don't have any other dependencies. I don't have a service. I'm not talking to a repository. So we can write a simple unit test against this class, against this controller class. And so as I said, let's go back to the README and let me put it in this format so we can see it. When we have the RestTestClient, we have different ways to test your API. So you'll see it in a second when I create this test class for the simple controller. To create an instance of the REST client, I'm going to use one of these helper methods. I'm going to either bind to a controller, something like MockMVC, the application context, a server, or a router function. So I put this together, the speed, this is the fastest one. We're binding to a controller. We just need to test our controller. This is best used when you're using quick unit tests. Now, if you have dependencies, when you're using bindToController, you will need to manually mock those dependencies out. If you want to bring in support for something like @mockmean, then you can bind to MockMVC. So I want you just to have this for reference, but I'm going to walk you through all of these right here. So I have this simple to-do controller. And what I want to do is I want to create a test class. So I'm going to create a test, simple to-do controller test. Sure, we can go ahead and set some stubs up for that. So the first thing I want to do is get the RestTestClient. Oh, I did. I bet you I didn't do something when we started this video. I did not. I did not switch over to Spring Boot 4. So we want Spring Boot 4, in this case, release candidate 1. We want to make sure we do that. And now I can say RestTestClient, sure. And I'm just going to call this client. All right, so now what we need is we need a setup. So I'm going to say before void setup, and I need an instance of this client. So I got to create an instance of this client. So RestTestClient dot, and you'll see those methods that we just talked about earlier. Bind to controller, application context, server, router function, server, etc. So I'm going to bind to a controller. And to bind to that controller, I'm just going to say new to do simple. What did I call that? Did I not call it? I called it simple to do controller. New. I want to refactor that because at the end of the day, I think in the final version, I have it as to do simple controller. Okay. So let's do that. And then test. Let's just refactor this as well to do simple controller test. Nope, that's good. So what I want to do is just say new to do simple controller, right? So now I can go ahead and, no, I want to set this to the client. Come on, Dan. So client is equal to that. And then we'll just go ahead and build that. So now we've built an instance of this using this bindToController method, and we've set it to the client. So now we can go ahead and use that. So I want to say client.get. I figured I'd come back on camera for this just to have this little discussion, but I don't know about you, but for me, there were just so many different ways to test things in the past. This is great. Lots of tools for lots of different scenarios. For me, the RestTestClient, you get this nice Fluent API and you can use it for everything. And I'm no longer guessing like which imports I have to use, what mechanism do I have to test this thing. I can just test all the things with this nice, easy API. I hope that comes through here in a second. And then I'll give it a URI. So the first URI is that API/todos/simple. All right. And then actually, let's double check this because I messed this up in the past. So simple is simple slash. So, right. So let's get that right. And then what I can do is perform an exchange. And now I can perform some assertions on this. Like I want to make sure the status is okay. I want to expect that the body is a new parameterized type reference, right? Ultimately, that is going to be a list of to-dos, right? So I can do that. Then I want to go ahead and return the result and get the response body. Now I can turn that into a variable called to-dos, right? And now I can make some assertions on this. So I want to assert equals. And what I want to assert is that the expected size is 1 and the to-dos.size is the actual. I can also go ahead and say assert equals, and I want to make sure that the to-do in the first one is the title of that is first to-do. So I'll say todos.get, we'll get the first one, and then we'll get the title out of that. So now I've made a nice Fluent call using the RestTestClient. Here's the URI. I'm performing an exchange. I expect the status is okay. I expect that the body is going to look like this. And then we'll see an example of this in the next one, like how we can control like different things with the body. Like, hey, I want to match it up to a specific type. And in this case, that's a list of to-dos. And when I have a list, I want to go ahead and get the results so I can compare some things. And in this case, I'm just testing the size and maybe the first to-do. So let's go ahead and run this and see if this works. And it doesn't. That's okay. 404 not found. So we are using /APIs/todos/simple. Did I? Man, I would say most of my problems have to do with spelling. So let's run that again. And now that works. Cool. So now let's test out another example. And again, the great part about this is this is a unit test. We are not involving any other outside classes. We are just testing the functionality of this simple controller. And it's fast. So it's really fast. We get this fast feedback loop. So now I'm going to set up a to-do. So let's say new to-do. No, not that one. New to-do. And we'll say 1, 1. We'll say first to-do. And we'll say this was completed. We'll set up a to-do. We'll call it to-do. And I'm going to use that now. So I'm going to say client.get. The URI is going to be kind of like that. So /API/todos simple. And then remember, we pass in an ID for that. I'm going to exchange that. I'm going to expect the status is okay. And now I can expect the body to be of type to do. So I can say, hey, make sure it's like this to do thing that I'm working with. I can also say is equal to the to do that I have there. So I'm matching it up against that to do. So if I want to do kind of an assertion on the whole response back, it's going to be this type and it's actually going to be equal to this. I can also go ahead and get individual values. So if I wanted to, I can say value, I could pass in that to do, and then I can do some assertions. So assert equals 1L t.id. So again, we'll probably do this 4 times. This one is going to be the user ID. This one is going to be the title. So I'll say first to do. And then this will be the title. And then finally, we want to make sure that it's true. And what's coming from that is the completed. All right. So now we have, again, some more options for kind of asserting some values here. So I'm going to go ahead and run this one. And I missed something there. That's okay. Let's run that again. And it passes. And now we can go ahead and just test this out and see if we can run this and all our tests pass. All right, but let's take this a step further. Let's go ahead and say we had a to-do service. So to-do service, and this is going to be a service, and we are going to just paste some code in here. I get an instance of the REST client. I use the builder to build an instance. Here is the service I'm going to talk to. This is a public API. You can copy this code. And then the REST client we use to talk to the to-dos endpoint. We get a list of to-dos. We talk to /to-dos and the ID, and we get a to-do for that particular ID. Now, I will say we are in 4.0. So one other thing I've been mentioning in these videos where I'm talking about features of Spring Framework 7 and Spring Boot 4 is the modularization of the auto configuration. So we used to have all the auto configuration in a single jar. Now we've kind of broken that out. So everything is much more modularized. So what this means is you can go read the documentation to learn a little bit more. There's also a really good blog post on the road to GA over on the Spring AL blog. I'll try to include that in the description as well. What this means is I need to include the REST client. So REST client. No, that's not it. I need to include the Spring Boot REST client here to be able to use that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now that error should go away. So now I have a service. Now what I want to do is create a to-do controller that uses this service. And that's why I created the simple one first, so we can just create one here. So I'll say to-do controller. This is going to be a REST controller with a request mapping of /API/to-dos. And then we'll go ahead and get an instance of that to-do service. Sure, that looks good. We'll create a get mapping for finding all of the to-dos. So this is a list of to-do, find all, and then we will return the to-do service find all method. And again, we'll do this for something with an ID. And so we can say public to-do, find by ID, takes along, and then uses the to-do service to return that. Okay, so similar functionality, but now we've involved another dependency, which is the to-do service. So now I need to write a test for this. So let's go ahead and create a test. Sure, to-do controller test. These are the methods that I'm going to take a look at and test. And so then the question becomes, okay, how do I test this out? All right, and I think I'm just going to rename this because we might actually perform a couple different tests here. So I want to separate these out. So let's just call this the, oops, not that one. I don't want to rename that. I want to rename this one. And we'll call this the to-do controller mock test. All right. So in this test, we are going to need that RestTestClient. So I'll say RestTestClient, client. And then I'm also going to need the to-do service because I am not bringing in Spring. So ultimately what I would have to do is mock the to-do service. So let's go ahead and create this before each. And in here, we're going to have to mock our to-do service. We need to mock to-do service. So how are we going to do that? We're going to say to-do service is equal to, and we can use Mockito. No, not Mockito there. Mockito.mock, and we can mock that class. So the to-do service.class, that is the one we are mocking. So when we mock that, so when Mockito.when. All right, so when we call that, so when we call to-do service.findAll, what we want to do is then return a list of those. So I'm going to return basically the same thing I did before, list.of, new to-do, 1L, first to-do, and true completed, right? So now that I have that, now I can say client is equal to, again, the RestTestClient dot bind to. In this case, it's just the new to-do controller, but the controller takes a dependency of type to-do service. But now I have a mock of that I can pass in, and now I can go ahead and build that. And what is this saying? It's required type. Oh, bind to. Oh no, bindToController. Thank you very much. So now I've basically set this up, and I'm going to copy some code because, again, it's pretty similar to what we saw before. We're just making, using that client, making a call to /API/todos now. And then the same code that we saw before. So hopefully this will work because we've mocked out that to-do service. And there we go. So that's one case. Maybe I still want to keep this like a purely functional unit test, mocking something out, not involving other dependencies, still very fast. The next thing I want to do is bring in support for MockMVc. So let's create a new test in here. I'm going to go ahead and say new Java class. We're going to call this the to-do controller MockMVc test. All right. All right. So I'm going to use the WebMVC test. Oh, I think I've run into this problem again. Yes. So we've done this for the testing as well. So I need to add another dependency here. This is going to be the Spring Boot Starter WebMVC test. Yes, so this will come from here. I actually don't think I need this one. And again, this, if I would have selected Spring Boot 4 from the starter, we would have fixed this problem, but that's okay. So now let's see if we can go WebMVC test. Yes. Now I'm including the to-do controller as part of this test. So again, what we're doing here is this creates a Spring context. So now we are involving Spring, but we're not involving all of Spring. Again, important thing to remember with these slice tests are we are just testing a slice of the application. In this case, the web side of things, the WebMVC side of things. So we will create all the beans necessary to test the web. But if there are things like data or other things that we needed to test, those dependencies would not get created. But now we are involving Spring. And so what's this mean? I can go ahead and say at AutoWired, I can bring in MockMVC. So MockMVC. I can also use something like Mockito Bean, which is the newer annotation for something like MockBean that you would have used in the past. And now I can go ahead and mock out my to-do service. And then I can also get my RestTestClient, call that client. So now in my setup, what I want to do is actually bind to that MVC. So I can use the RestTestClient bindTo method. You see that this takes in MockMVC. I can get MockMVC. I can create, I just want this as a client stand. So client, and that should be that. So now I'm binding to MockMVC. So now I get again, the power of combining the best of all the worlds, like I said in the beginning, which is like, hey, I want to use the MockMVC support. I want to use something like WebTestClient and it's like Fluent API. I'm combining like the best of both worlds. So again, this is MockMVC, the main entry point for server-side Spring MVC testing support. And so we get to do both of those. So now what I can do, let's go ahead and copy pasta. We don't need to look at this. A lot of this is going to be the same, just a different way of kind of handling it. Now I can mock out when this happens, but I've already mocked that bean, right? So I didn't have to manually mock it. But again, this code kind of looks the same. And now I can, I think I've did this twice here. We don't need to do this. And now we can test the validation. Hey, when there's the new to-do should look something like this and make sure that it's a bad request, right? So let's go ahead and run these. Should validate inputs. Method not allowed. I actually don't have this in this one, so that's okay. So going back over to our trusty README, and opening up something that looks like this. So if we bind to MockMVC, this is fast, still not the fastest because we are involving Spring a little bit, right? But not the full application context, which is important. What can we test? We can test our controller along with some of the Spring MVC functionality. Like if we did want to do testing on validation or security, we would need to reach for this. The bindToController would not allow us to do that because we are not bringing in any Spring. So we've done that. What about the next case? What if we wanted to test or bind to the application context? Now we get the full app. We get all of the dependencies in our application. We can do real database testing, but this is a little bit slower, all right? Just something to know because we will be loading in all of the application context. So if you have a huge app, this may not be something you want to do, but it is available to you. So let's take a look at how we do that. So I'm going to create a new class to do controller context test, right? And so for here, we're using the @SpringBoot test annotation. So this is basically the full Spring context, but important to know, no server by default. We are not starting up a server here, okay? So I'll need a couple of things here to get auto-wired in. I will need a web application context. We'll see why in a second. I will need that to-do service. So I'm going to auto-wire in that to-do service. That is a real one. That is not a mock one now. And then I'll go ahead and get the RestTestClient. We'll call that client. And that should be everything we need. So now in my setup, I will need to use the RestTestClient bindToApplicationContext. So we will take that in as an argument here, context, and then we can pass that in here. We can go ahead and build that, and then that is what we are going to set our client to. Again, similar code. Code doesn't change much, but what we are doing, what we are binding to, does kind of change what we're doing, right? So now we've said, all right, we're going to make that call. We make sure everything's okay. We make sure we get a list back. But now we are not mocking things out. We are actually using that to-do service. And that to-do service reaches out to an actual API to get the APIs. So this time we expect the status to be 200. Because we are performing an integration test, we are integrating other dependencies, and we are making a live call. This isn't a full end-to-end test though, because we are not involving servers. So we don't need to like test for things like cores and things like that. But this is going to get all 200. And the first one happens to have this title, which is some Latin that I am not going to even try to pronounce, right? So let's see if we can go ahead and run this one. And that passes, which means we've gotten the live data back, which was 200 of those. All right, so back here, now we can go ahead and include a server. So we haven't done that yet. This is slower. This is going to be the slowest because we are including a server. So this kind of is a complete end-to-end test. We can test everything we need to, including any of the HTTP bits. We can test headers, things like that. We can involve the server for a full kind of end-to-end test. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's create one more test in here. We'll say bindToController server test. And we are going to say Spring Boot test. We are going to set our web environment to a random port. So we're going to set it to a random port here. We can go ahead and get that port. We can say local server port. And that can be private int port. And then we'll go ahead and get our RestTestClient as we have been. We'll call this client. We'll go into our before each in our setup method, and we'll use the RestTestClient to bind to a server this time. And then the server will basically say we'll set a base URL. So in this case, the base URL is localhost plus a port because we don't know what port it's running on. And then we'll just go ahead and build an instance of this. And if you used a REST client before, that code should look pretty familiar. So now, again, I'll just go ahead and I'm going to copy some tests here. We'll go ahead and paste these in. And this one should look pretty familiar. This time we're using real HTTP. We want to make sure we get 200. We want to make sure the first one has this title and is completed. We want to test a to-do. So we want to get one to-do from the server. We're doing some assertions on those values. And then I have a test here. Verify the port is actually set and that the server is running. So we're asserting that the port is greater than 0 and asserting that it's not equal to, it should be a random port by default, not running on 8080. So let's go ahead and run these tests. And not, this.client is null. So let's say client equals, and let's go ahead and run that again. And now those look good. So there you have it, the new testing support in Spring Framework 7 and Spring Boot 4 using the RestTestClient. I don't know for you, but for me, as we went through this, just kind of seeing how easy it was, that Fluent API that we have, you call client.get post put delete, and then you give it a URI, you make an exchange, and then you can start to assert things. And it's just like, even if you've never used this before and you started reading it, expect the status is okay. Expect that the body looks like this. Expect that some of the return values look like this. It's just very easy to understand. And for me, it's less to wrap my head around. Now I can just use the RestTestClient and all these different scenarios that come up, whether I'm writing a simple unit test or I want to make an integration test. Maybe I'm mocking some things out. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I want to write a full application context test where I'm involving all of the Spring context so that I can do a bunch of things. Or maybe I want to set up a real server and test some like HTTP bits as well. Every scenario that I need, I have access to here, and all packaged up in one nice REST test client. Whew, I had some fun putting this to video because I got to learn some things too. I hope you learned some things. If you did, you know what to do, friends. Leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.